We are in a series entitled Living Rich. Now, when we hear that term, we automatically think material possessions. We think, oh boy, the heck, living rich, winning the lottery, what would that be like? Wouldn't that be cool to not have to work? Living rich, however, is so much more than money, isn't it? Living rich lives are so much more than accumulating material possessions. To live a rich life means to live a life of justice. We started off this series to talk about that, how God desires to see us living lives filled with justice, so much so that it's like as deep as the ocean, that rivers of justice would flow out of our lives. And then last week we talked about living a rich life means living a life of generosity. When you live a life of generosity, when you live a life that is not just about ourselves but about others, and we realize that everything we have comes from God and we generously share it, there comes a richness in life. There comes an aspect of purpose and fulfillment. And that's why our church is so passionate about being connected to our community. And so today, when you leave, make sure you get at least one basket, maybe two, whatever the Lord has on your heart to do, because justice will flow out of your life, generosity will flow out of your life, and a mom with her child is going to be blessed this Easter because of your life. And that is what brings richness into our lives. And I encourage you, if you have a young family, do this with your kids. Go to the store and teach them how generosity is such a big piece of life. Help them realize that though we may have the necessities in our closets and in our cupboards, there are those in our community that don't. And so we share. And teaching your kids at a young age is really important. And so this morning, we continue our series, and there's some notes there in your bulletin. Hopefully they'll be helpful to you as you follow along. But rich in service. Living a life of service, living a life of serving others will bring a dynamic richness into your life that is almost indescribable. I have noticed that some of the greatest leaders in history are leaders who have understood the fact that it doesn't matter what the title is in front of their name that really matters. It's what comes out of their life in service of others that really matters. Let's take one of the great historical leaders, the late Nelson Mandela. Mandela said these words. He said, "I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people." You see, what made Mandela an incredible leader is because he got this. He understood that his position and his role wasn't about the title in front of his name, but that he was there for the purpose of serving the people. Well-known NFL coach who is respected for his leadership, Vince Lombardi, he said these words. He said, "The price of success is hard work. Dedication to the job at hand and the determination that whether we win or lose, we have applied the best of ourselves to the task at hand." You see, servants get this. They understand that there's going to be wins and there's going to be losses. There's going to be great moments of jubilation and there's going to be utter defeat. But servants realize, and they're not afraid of dedication, of determination, of working hard. Friends, nothing worth doing comes easy, does it? It takes a lot of hard work. It takes some ups and it takes some downs, but the true servant leader is willing to be determined, is willing to dedicate their entire life to the task at hand. And so we speak this morning of living a life rich of service. But you know, the leader above all other leaders, his name is Jesus. Jesus shows us what it is to live a life of service. Jesus, being very nature God, makes himself man a humble servant. Jesus does not come to be served, but to serve. And this morning, Jesus is awesome. Have you experienced his service into your life? He serves you and I in so many different ways, doesn't he? He serves with his grace. He serves with his mercy. He serves us with his generosity. He serves us with his health. He serves us with resources and talents and ability. Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. And I want this morning to kind of draw a picture of a day in the life of Jesus, the greatest leader of them all. It's found in Matthew chapter 9, and if you have your Bibles, you can go there. But if you don't, there are some Bibles in the seats in front of you. You can borrow one of those, or just look at your notes that have been provided there for you. But Matthew chapter 9 is really a snapshot of the life of Christ, how he really did come to serve the human family with everything that he had, to the point of death. Matthew chapter 9 gives us a glimpse in the life of Christ. It starts off with Jesus. He gets out of a boat, and as he steps out of the boat onto the seashore, these men, they bring to him a paralytic man. He's paralyzed, and they bring him on a mat, and they say, Jesus, what are you going to do with this guy? And Jesus says, my son, your sins are forgiven. Now, the Pharisees and the religious leaders, they're standing around, and they're hearing what Jesus said, and they're like, what did he just say? Did he just say, forgive their sins? Only but God can forgive sin. Who does he think he is? This is blasphemy. And Jesus knows what's in their hearts, and he says, listen, just so that you understand who I am, I'll heal this man. And he restores him and he heals him. But he says to them, he says, you know, what's easier, to heal broken legs, paralyzed legs, or to forgive sin? He's making a point to them. He's saying to them, you're right, I'm God, and yet have come to seek and to save what is lost. And so he restores this paralytic man, and notice what happens in verse 9 from there. It says, as Jesus went on from there. So he walks away from this healing of this paralytic, and he walks away, and he sees Matthew. Now, Matthew, he's a tax collector. That means he doesn't have the greatest reputation. I mean, tax guys weren't cool, because they would rip people off of their money, well-earned money. And so they were kind of the outcasts of societies. And yet Jesus stops and he looks at Matthew and he says, hey, Matt, I want to come over to your house and have some dinner with you. I'm sure Matthew was astonished and shocked. He's like, Jesus, this so-called prophet, son of God, he wants to come to my house. So, of course, he says, come on in. And there's Jesus in Matthew's house. And, of course, again, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, are watching all of this, and they start saying, who does he think he is? Does he realize he's hanging out with sinners? Does he realize he's hanging out with those that don't have the greatest of reputation? What kind of a Jesus is this, that he sits with sinners? They don't have all their lives together, and yet he's spending time with them. And in Jesus' day, for somebody to eat with somebody, it wasn't just an acquaintance, it was a friend. And so Jesus is basically making a point. I am a friend of sinners. And so he sits there at Matthew's table, and obviously Matthew brings his entire clan of friends. So now it's not just Matthew. I mean, his house is full of other tax collectors and other folks that don't have the best of reputation. And Jesus is spending dinner with them. Religious people don't like that, do they? And so they criticize Jesus. In fact, in verse 14, then all of a sudden John's disciples show up. And they start looking down on Jesus and his disciples, saying, shouldn't you guys be fasting? I mean, if you were really spiritual, you wouldn't be eating with these sinners. And Jesus talks to them and he says, guys, you don't get it, do you? The fact is, the bridegroom, me, the Son of God, is in your presence today. It's a time of celebration and rejoicing. There will be a time when I'll be gone, and there'll be moments where fasting is really critical to your spiritual lives. But now isn't the time. I'm actually in the house with you. Let's celebrate and rejoice in that. And as he's speaking to these religious folks and as he's having dinner with the sinners of the day, verse 18 says, while he was saying this, so remember, it started off with just coming off of a boat. He gets off a boat, paralytic brought to him. He restores him, forgives him of his sins. Next thing you know, he walks around and he finds Matthew. He's at Matthew's house with dinner, having dinner with all of his posse. And they're having dinner, and then all of a sudden the religious leaders start talking to him about fasting, and he responds to them. Now all of a sudden, something else happens. While he was saying this, a ruler comes in, and he kneels at the feet of Christ, and he says, listen, he says, I know you're amazing. My daughter has just died, and she's in our home. Won't you come visit us? I know that if you just come, if you just lay your hand on her, something amazing is going to happen. And so what does Jesus do? He gets up from the table with his disciples to get their belongings together, and they begin to walk to this ruler's house. What a day this has been so far, hasn't it? And as he's en route to this ruler's house who has this daughter who has just passed away, the scriptures say, while he was on the way, just then, in verse 20, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years fought her way through the crowds of people. She thought, if I can only touch the hem of the garment of Jesus, then I would be restored, because this Jesus, there's something about him that's like no other. And so she fights through the crowds, finally touches the hem of the garment of Christ, and power gets released out of him, and she gets healed on the spot. He's en route to the ruler's house. Finally gets to the ruler's house. The funeral procession has begun. The flute players are playing. Jesus walks in and he says, okay, guys, you're done. Out. The scriptures say that they laughed at him. What do you mean? She's dead. He's like, no, she's not. He walks into her room and he lays his hands on her and he resurrects her from the dead. You can only imagine this moment. You can only imagine what the disciples are thinking at this time, right? I mean, it just started off with getting out of a boat. Get out of a boat, and you're thinking what the day is going to look like, and boy, did the day fill up pretty quick, didn't it? But Jesus came to serve, not to be served. And so wherever he went, wherever the needs of the people were, Jesus serves the people by meeting their needs. He gets off the boat, paralytic, forgives him his sins, restores him. Next thing you know, he calls Matthew. He's in Matthew's house, having dinner with Matthew and all of his friends, and he's sitting with them. Next thing you know, the Pharisees are criticizing him. Next thing you know, John's disciples come in. They ask him about fasting. He has to answer their questions. As he's answering their questions, all of a sudden a ruler walks in and says, hey, my daughter has just died. Gets his stuff together, goes to the ruler's house. On the way to the ruler's house, this woman who's dealing with this issue for 12 years touches the hem of his garment, heals her, finally gets to the ruler's house, resurrects this dead girl. Whew. That's a full day, isn't it? And it doesn't end. As he's leaving the ruler's house, as Jesus went on from there in verse 27, 2 blind men show up. Have mercy on us, O God. We can't see. And Jesus says, do you believe that if I pray over you, God can heal you? Yeah, we believe that. He restores their sight. And finally, to top it all off, at the end of a long day, this man who was demonic, filled with demons in his life and was mute and couldn't speak, is brought to him, and Jesus rebukes the demonic oppression over this man's life, and he's free again, and his mouth gets loosened and he can speak again. I want you to imagine being the disciples watching all of this happen. I'm sure they were exhausted. Remember, Jesus was just like us in terms of the flesh, and he got tired and he got weary. I'm sure that's why he got up real early in the mornings and says, Father, I'm going to need your help today because I'm going to need your strength. There's going to be a lot of needs around me, and I'm going to need you to help me. And the scriptures say at the end of this chapter that Jesus went, in verse 35, through all the towns and all the villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless. And that's a point there. What motivated Jesus to sacrifice and serve need after need after need? Because when he saw people, he had compassion on them. He saw them as being harassed at every corner. He saw them as being helpless and like sheep without a shepherd. And then this is what I believe is the apex of this chapter. After all that has transpired, he looks over to his disciples and he says these words: the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. You see, the question isn't that, is there a harvest to be reaped? Is there people to be reached? Is there people to be helped? Oh, there is, friend. The challenge is there's not enough laborers. And he looks at his disciples, and in many ways he's saying to them, one day when I go to heaven, I'm leaving you the responsibility to make a difference on earth, to make this planet better because you're in it. And that's going to take some labor. It's going to take you guys to understand that it's going to take servant-hearted people who are willing to be inconvenienced. Disciples, did you see how inconvenienced I was today? From one thing to the next, over and over again. I want you to understand that there's going to be a level of determination that's going to be needed. There's going to be a level of labor and work. And there's going to be moments where you're going to feel exhausted. But I've called you not to be served, but to serve. And when you do that, there will be such a richness that comes into your life that it's going to be indescribable, because all of a sudden, it's when you give your life away that you find it. It's there that you find purpose, fulfillment, destiny for your life. And then, near the end of the life of Christ, he just bangs this message home to his disciples. He wants this thing etched in his mind. He knows Judas, one of his disciples, has already betrayed him. He's already got an under-the-table deal for some cash that they're going to come in, they're going to grab Jesus, and they're going to crucify him. And so Jesus knows this is one of the last moments he'll have with these guys around the dinner table. And so he gets up from the dinner table. The disciples must be looking at him going, what is he doing? And he goes over and he grabs the servant's towel. You know, in Jesus' day, whenever you went into somebody's house, there was a servant there who would wash your feet, wash your hands, maybe give you some oil for your hair because of the long journey you had been on, walking through towns. And Jesus walks over to the servant towel. What's he going to do? The disciples must have thought. Is he going to give it over to the servant and say, hey, can you wash my feet? I got things to do. Is he going to command the servant to wash all of our... What's he going to do? Jesus takes the servant's towel, and the scriptures say he wrapped it around his waist. Oh, man, you can imagine this moment, right? The disciples are going, what is he doing? He's Jesus. He's the Son of God. He's in very nature God himself. Why is he even touching that towel? And he wraps it around, and all of a sudden he starts walking towards them. They're like, what is he doing? And he gets down on his knees. And he starts washing their feet. One by one. I'm sure they were thinking like Peter did, thought to himself, whoa, 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 whoa. Jesus, you can't do this. If anything, I'm supposed to be washing your feet. You're God. You're my Savior. You're my Messiah. In fact, he says that to Jesus. Jesus, I can't let you do that. And Jesus says, Pete, if you don't let me do this, you have no part of me. Whoa, that's pretty harsh, Jesus. I mean, if many of us were there that day, we probably would have done the same thing. It kind of sounds kind of respectful, actually. I mean, Peter, he realizes that Jesus is the one who should be getting his feet washed. It sounds like an honorable thing to say. But you see, what Peter didn't understand, you see, Peter thought in his mind, leaders don't wash feet. And Jesus wanted him to know that he was wrong. He wanted him to know that if you're going to make a difference on this planet, you better get your servant's towel on and make life more about others than yourself. You see, if Peter was the leader that day, he wouldn't have put the servant's towel around his waist, would he? And Jesus wanted him to know, you got to get your heart back in the right place, Pete. And he gets down and he washes Peter's feet. Because he wants Peter to know that he's called Peter to be a servant. He wants Peter to know that it doesn't matter what the title is in front of your name. It doesn't matter what degrees you have on the wall. I've called you to be a servant. And the way the kingdom of God works is that it will be established by servants. He even gets to the feet of Judas. What does he do there? He actually gets down. He gets back down on his knees and he washes Judas's feet, knowing full well that he's already betrayed him. What does that say about our Jesus? It says that nobody is exempt. We can't have a list to say, I don't serve those kinds of people. Those kinds of people, thanks, but no thanks. Somebody else will be called to serve them. See, the true servant serves even when they are treated like a servant. And Jesus gets down on his knees and he serves his enemy. See, Jesus' way is different than the cultural way, isn't it? And he gets up and he walks over and maybe the scriptures don't tell us, but maybe he took that towel and he held it and he says, hey guys, so I've showed you what true leadership looks like. Now do the same. Live your lives for the sake of others. He says, I'm going to go in a few hours, but I'm going to leave you the towel. You going to grab it? Because I just showed you how to do it. And if you do it the way I tell you, you're going to be blessed. You see, that's where the richness of life comes. When God says you're going to be blessed if you do something, he means it. When you give your life of service away, you'll be full and rich with purpose and destiny. It's when we get caught up with our titles and our corner offices that, in many ways, life walks out on us. Jesus, the ultimate servant, he stands here today and he looks out into the crowd of Heartland and he says, you ready to serve your community? It'll mean you're going to spend some time with some sinners. Is that okay? It might get a bit messy. You know, the Pharisees, they criticized them for hanging out with people who maybe didn't have a solid background or were having issues with addictions or whatever it is. Maybe they've been married several times. Jesus says, you going to serve them? Because Jesus says to them, he says, I didn't come for the healthy. I came for the sick. So the question becomes this morning, who do we serve? Who do we serve? There's this fascinating Old Testament situation in 2 Kings chapter 17 that almost scares me when it relates to this whole topic of who do we serve. Let me give you the background of this story. The king of Assyria, which was the enemy of the people of God, he sends all the people of God out of their land. And so he's got this empty land now. And so what does he do? He brings people from all different communities into that land to replace the people of God. So when they get to the land, they bring all their religious memorabilia with them. And so they're worshiping their idols and they're worshiping their gods. But this is God's land. And so the Lord allows there to be some lions to come into the camp of the people, and the lions start killing some of the folks living in this new area. So the king of Assyria gets word. One of his servant aides comes and says, hey, king, something bad's happening in that town. You know how you brought all these people from all different parts? Well, there's some lions in the camp. The God of that land isn't happy. You better do something. And so the king of Assyria thinks of an idea. He says, okay, this is what we'll do. We'll get one of the priests of the people of God who we've kicked out of the land to go back and teach them what it is to worship God. How would you like that job? So the priest walks into a lion-infested town with all these folks who are worshiping all other gods. And look what happens. Verse 28, so one of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship the Lord. Nevertheless, each national group made its own gods in the several towns. They worshiped the Lord, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate for them as priests in the shrines at the high places. They worshiped the Lord, verse 33, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. What's going on? So in one moment they're worshiping God. Maybe it was a weekly celebration like this. They would worship God because the priest taught them, because the lions. But then they would also serve their other small g gods on the side. They worship God one moment, but they serve their other gods another. Verse 39, rather worship the Lord your God. It is he who will deliver you from the land or the hand of all your enemies. And they would not listen. However, but persisted in their former practices. Even while these people were worshiping the Lord, they were serving their idols. To this day, their children and grandchildren continue to do as their fathers did. Pretty scary, isn't it? That means we could be worshiping God one moment, but yet serving idols the next. There are some obstacles here to living a life in sincere service. One of the things that I learned in reading this passage is that these people had a religion based on fear. You see, the Samaritans would have never thought of God had it not been for the lions. They just were scared of the lions. That's why they would worship God maybe once a week, or because they didn't want the lions to kill them. And so their religion was based on fear, not because they actually loved God, not because they actually believed in God, not because they actually wanted to follow God, not because they wanted to serve God, but they were just scared of the lions. And sometimes in our lives, we can go to God and say, Lord, I worship you, but because I want your blessing, or I don't want bad things to happen to me, so I'm going to kind of do my religious thing here on Sunday, and hopefully it all works, okay? It's a religion based on fear. The other piece to this is it was a religion based on compromise. You see, the Samaritans had God, but they also had gods. They liked the latter best. They gave God lip service, but they gave the gods their true service. So that means It's possible that Joel and his friends that are gathered here today can sing, I surrender all. Okay, I'll stop singing. But we can sing these songs and maybe walk out the door and serve all sorts of other gods throughout the whole week. It's possible, isn't it? Now, our small g gods can look a whole lot different than the gods that they were serving. They might not have shrines, but maybe it's money. We live our whole life for money and more of it. Maybe it's our careers. Maybe it's our material possessions. Maybe it's our families. Maybe even our families are a bigger priority than God himself. And God, if at the end of the week you kind of fit into all of our activities as a family, then we'll kind of fit you in there somewhere. Maybe once every 3 weeks. How's that? Is that a good deal? Because the Lions, I don't like those. So all of our tendencies as it relates to serving other gods, they can look all different for all of us. For me, growing up, it was sports. Sports was everything for me. Watching it, playing all sorts of different sports, until God got a hold of my life and says, Joel, what about if I took a sport away from you? Are you okay with that? So it looked differently for everybody that's here. But who are you serving? Who are you serving today? Came across a true story. The great violinist Niccolo Pagnani, who left in his will this marvelous violin to his city of birth, Genoa, but only under one condition, that the instrument would never be played upon. It was an unfortunate condition, for it is a peculiarity of wood that as long as it is used and handled, it shows little wear. As soon as it is discarded, it begins to decay. The exquisite, mellow-toned violin has become worm-eaten in its beautiful case, valueless except as a relic. The moldering instrument is a reminder that a life withdrawn from all service to others loses its meaning. When we withdraw ourselves in this little bubble and make life only about ourselves, in many ways, at the end of the day, our lives are but a relic. God intends us to be men and women of service. Men and women who will expend their lives for others' sake. And when you do that, friend, you will be blessed. You will live a rich life, I promise you. It'll get exhausting. It'll be challenging. It'll be inconvenient. It'll get messy. But you'll get the divine nod of approval by your Father in heaven, and there'll be nothing like it. Nothing. And so, I want to give you, in conclusion, some principles to living a life rich in service. Here's some practical advice of how do I make sure that I don't just give God lip service, but I give him my life, Monday to Saturday, not just Sunday. That all of a sudden my employment, it's not just a job. I'm there to make a difference to those people I interact with. My recreational time, it's not just recreational. God is going to give me opportunities there. Lord, I've got my towel in hand. What do you want me to do? So here's some practical advice to making sure that we live a life rich in service. Number one, make yourself available to what matters most. You got to be intentional to carve out areas of your life calendar that says, I'm going to have segments of my life available to the work of God. If you don't do that, it won't exist. Servants don't fill up their time with other pursuits that limit their availability to what matters the most. Servants do what's needed, even when it's inconvenient. Jesus could have said, listen, I've done enough today. He chose to be inconvenient on the way here, on the way there, on the way. A lot of times God calls us to do things when we're trying to get from point A to point B. Do we stop somewhere in the middle when he says, I need you to do something? It's gonna be inconvenient. When you serve around Heartland, we have the best volunteers, and I mean that. But let's face it, sometimes it gets inconvenient, doesn't it? I got to come earlier. I got to go through some training. Saturday, if you came in this church, was band practices going on for Easter. A lot of those people gave most of their Saturdays. That's inconvenience. But servants say, inconvenience? It's but a privilege to do the work of the Lord. I'll carve that out of my schedule, and I'm there. I admire that. As a servant, you don't always get to pick and choose when or where you will serve. I know most of life works that way, but in the kingdom, you don't always get to pick. Being a servant means giving up the right to control your schedule sometimes and allowing God to interrupt it whenever he needs to. Number 2, do every task with equal dedication. Do every task with equal dedication. Servants get this. Whatever they do, servants do it, as Colossians says, do it with all their heart. No matter how small it might be or how big it'll be, they do it with everything that they've got. You'll never arrive. Servants will never arrive. Friends, you will never arrive. Joel will never arrive to a state in life where you're too important to help with menial tasks. You'll never get to the point where God won't tap you on the shoulder to do something menial. God will never exempt you from the mundane. I mean, I love what Paul says in Galatians 6:3, and you can laugh if you want. If you think you are too important to help somebody in need, you're only fooling yourself. You're really a nobody. He's like, don't get so high on yourself that you can't be bothered with the little things. You know who I am, sir? I don't do that. Number 3, finish what you start. Servants finish what they start. Servants finish their tasks. They fulfill their responsibilities. They keep their promises, and they complete their commitments. Friends, our world needs this. People who actually fulfill the promises that they make. That when they say they're going to be somewhere, they show up. Wow. And they show up on time. They don't leave a job half done. They don't quit when they get discouraged. They're trustworthy. They're dependable. Number 4, keep it quiet. Keep it on the low. Servants understand this. You see, servants don't promote or call attention to themselves. Instead of acting to impress and dressing for success, they put on humility and serve one another to get the job done. Jesus hated service for the purpose of self-promotion. And so our motives for serving matters to God, doesn't it? Why do you serve? Jesus would say, be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. And so keep it on the low when you serve. And finally, number 5, continue to serve even when you're treated like a servant. This is tough, isn't it? It's tough for me. But in many ways, I'm so blessed to be a pastor. You know why? Because when somebody criticizes me, I have no choice but to still pastor them. I still have to love them. So I got nowhere to go. So Joel, even when you're treated like a servant, I've called you to serve them anyway. He's called us all to be that way. Rather than pull the pin when we're mistreated and said, you know what, I'm done with that guy. Jesus says, well, remember I put the towel around and I washed Judas's feet? I want you to do the same. Watch what he does when you do that. he transforms people's lives. Those are holy moments. That's Jesus' way to serve even when we're treated like a servant. Self-righteous service requires external rewards. It needs to know that people see and appreciate the effort. It seeks human applause. True service rests contented in hiddenness. It delights in knowing the divine nod of approval is really all that matters. True service delights only in the service. That's why the true servant can serve enemies as freely as friends. Rick Warren, well-known pastor and author, he said this: what matters is not the duration of your life, but the donation of it. Not how long you lived, but how you lived. How are you living? Love the worship team to come on up. Pastor Chris read this passage of Scripture in the middle of our worship set. And just hang in there with me. We're going to land this plane. We're going to land it. 1 Peter 4:10 and 11 says, each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others. So you see, the gifts that God has given to you, it's not just for yourself. The point is, it's for others. And you can use talents and gifts to make a career, and that's all good. But don't forget that it's for others. So he says, use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administrating God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, he should do it in one speaking the very words of God. And that's why I take my role real seriously. I don't just come up here and give you some of my opinions. God, during the week, I'm on my knees saying, God, I need you. I want to speak your words. And so hours go into these messages. It just doesn't happen. Why? Because God's given me a gift, and I want to steward it the best way I can. And I want to serve you with it every week. If anyone serves, he should do it with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory, the power, forever and ever. Amen. The whole point is him, isn't it? Your whole life is about him. So, will you grab a towel with me? Make our community better? Make our world better? We'll serve each other, care for each other, because we're passionate about God. You might say, oh, I don't really know what I can do. I mean, I don't really have anything to really offer. We come up with some fantastic excuses, don't we? I know I do. But when you read the scriptures, you find these ordinary men and women of God, and God does some extraordinary things to their life, not because they had these amazing abilities, but because they were willing to pick up the towel. That's it. I mean, Abraham, he was old. Jacob was insecure. Leah was unattractive. Joseph was abused. Moses stuttered. Gideon was poor. Samson was codependent. Rahab was immoral. David had an affair and all kinds of family problems. Elijah was suicidal. Jeremiah was depressed. Jonah was reluctant. Naomi was a widow. John the Baptist, well, he was eccentric. Peter was impulsive and hot-tempered. Martha worried a lot. The Samaritan woman, well, she had several failed marriages. Zacchaeus, he was unpopular. Thomas, he had doubts. Paul, he had a poor health. Timothy, he was timid. Lots of excuses, eh? But at the end of the day, God says, so are you done yet? Because I got a towel. And see what I do if you have the towel in your head. I'll do some amazing things through your life. In fact, I'm going to give you a rich life if you grab the towel. Oh, your life's going to be filled with purpose, destiny. It's going to be hard. It's going to be real hard at times. You're going to feel like quitting sometimes. But press through. Keep washing. Even when you're unappreciated. Even when it gets tough, keep washing. Trust me. When churches understand this, that the church is here for others and not for ourselves, communities get transformed.